Hey guys, and welcome back to Just Ask Jason. This week we were talking about the Protoevangelium, which means the first gospel. It's a really fancy word that's really only used in big, fat, dusty tomes about the Bible, and, well, frankly, I have a bone to pick with it. So we're going to talk about that this week, what it is, what it means for us, how we should interpret it, that sort of thing. And hopefully in the process, we'll learn a little bit about how we should interpret the Old Testament, or at least specific parts of the Old Testament. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, the Protoevangelium, literally it means the first gospel. It comes from two Greek words. The first one is protos, which means first, and the second one is euangelion, which is where we get the word evangelize, or actually also where we get the word gospel from. So, proto-euangelion, the first gospel, and the term is used to describe one singular verse in Genesis, which is weird because we hear first gospel and we think, all right, maybe it's like the first gospel that was written, which might be Matthew, might be Mark, or maybe it's the first gospel in the Gospels, like when you put them in order, so that would be Matthew, right? Or maybe it's the first gospel, like the first time the gospel is preached, and so then it would be the story of Pentecost in Acts 2 and 3. But it's actually not any of those. It's used to describe a verse in Genesis, specifically Genesis 3:15. The traditional reading is, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed. You will strike his heel, but he will crush your head. Now, widely held opinion on this verse is that it's a prophecy of Jesus. That way back in Genesis 3, God was already hinting at people, hey, guess what? One day I'm going to send this guy named Jesus, and he's going to beat Satan once and for all. And that's why it got the nickname, the first gospel, the Protoevangelium. Now, this is probably one of my least popular, widely held Bible opinions, but I have good reason for it. And before you get worried, it's not heresy. I actually agree with a lot of really well-known evangelical scholars on this. The names probably won't mean anything to you, but just in case you want to look them up, Scott McKnight and Gordon Wenham have both come out with the exact same position that I have on this verse, and they aren't the only ones, they're just the most recognizable. So I'm not a heretic, but this is going to be slightly controversial potentially. So I'm just going to lay my cards on the table. I don't think this verse is about Jesus. We'll spend the rest of the video talking about why, and I think we'll learn a little bit about how we should interpret the Old Testament in the process. But Genesis 3:15 probably isn't about Jesus. Now, if I'm wrong, if God ends up telling me one day, when I'm standing in front of the pearly gates, Jesus comes back or whatever, and they're like, hey, Genesis 3:15 really was about Jesus, all right, fine, I'll take that L, but I just don't think it is. And, well, let's get into the traditional interpretation first, and then we'll talk about why I disagree. The traditional interpretation goes something like this. The snake represents Satan. I have a problem with that. If you want to hear about it, go back to our sermon from last Sunday. We started our 2020 Christmas series, and we talked about Genesis 3. I don't even think the snake necessarily is Satan, so that's my first problem. But the traditional interpretation is the snake is Satan. The snake's seed is somehow also Satan. That's problem number 2 for me. How can the snake and the snake's seed both be Satan? But I'm willing to overlook those. The woman's seed is Jesus. The woman is obviously Eve because she's the one being talked to. And therefore, this is the first prophecy about Jesus' death and resurrection. The snake would strike his heel, and that's an image or a symbol for the crucifixion, but then in his resurrection and his ascension, that Jesus defeats death and defeats Satan, and therefore this is the first presentation of the gospel in the Bible. And it's all the way back in Genesis 3. This interpretation dates all the way back to at least 160 AD. That's the earliest that I could find, but I'm definitely not an early church scholar by any stretch of the imagination. But as far as I can tell, it stretches back to 160 AD to an early church leader that is rather famous named Justin Martyr. I have a love-hate relationship with the early church fathers and their writings, and here's why. First of all, they tend to be, at times, very, very helpful. When it comes to, language, because many of them spoke Greek, especially very, very early on, they tend to have a better perspective on the meaning of like certain debated words and like the syntax of different sentences in the scriptures and stuff like that. And so if you're like really looking into language, they can be super helpful. Second of all, they have a better historical perspective. They're closer to the events that happen. And so that means two things. First of all, they can give us context for certain letters that we wouldn't have otherwise. That doesn't happen very often. But second of all, they can actually fill in the blanks in between scriptures. And so they can do things like say, hey, I am the bishop of Ephesus, and I'm going to tell you how long John spent in Ephesus. And that's super cool. It's nice to have that historical context. Additionally, some of the things they write is just really, really inspirational. There's a document written pretty early on in the church's history called the Book of the Martyrs that is just like legendarily inspirational. There's also other documents like theological documents, one called the Didache. There's another one called the Shepherd. And the Didache and the Shepherd are both like super, super cool to read. And it gives you some insight into what the early church believed. And are they like scripture? Are they authoritative? No, but they're pretty orthodox and they're fun to read, and it tells you a lot about history, and they can be really helpful to the modern Christian. But there's some you run into with the early church fathers too. And I have this big rant about like allegorical interpretations versus the school of thought in Antioch, but ultimately it's really nerdy and it's not super helpful to this Devo. Suffice to say, sometimes interpretations from the early church fathers get weird. And the Protoevangelium is one of those cases where they took an idea or a rule of interpretation that in the modern sense we would consider to be really bad interpretation, namely reading Jesus into everything in the Old Testament, and then they just kind of like forced it in there and then grabbed the verse, ripped it out of its context, and ran with it. And unfortunately, this is one of very few cases where something from way back in the 2nd century AD just got carried through, like right through the Catholic years and into like the modern Protestant church. And we haven't done much to combat it. So that's my issue with this particular interpretation, or at least the beginning. Now, let's get into my actual evidence for why I disagree with Justin Martyr's interpretation and what I think is probably the more popular modern interpretation. And instead, I agree with people like Scott McKnight. My evidence is this. First of all, the word seed that occurs twice, it's a collective noun. Now, I'm not going to be too much of a grammar nerd, but basically a collective noun is a singular noun that refers to a group of people. So you might say like, my family is having dinner together. When I say my family, grammatically, the word family is a singular. It's one family. So I say my family is. I use singular words that agree with the singular family, right? One and one, right? Basic grammar. But when I say my family does not just include one person. My family can include dozens of people. If I'm talking like extended relatives of like, my parents and my cousins and uncles and aunts are coming into town, we could be talking about dozens of people, but I'm using a singular noun, my family. Seed is the same way. When I say my seed, or a way we might say it now is my progeny, it's a singular noun that describes everyone that's descended from me. All of my descendants are included in that singular. So it says, I will put enmity between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed. We're actually talking about groups of people. We're talking about descendants. Second of all, the translation, he will crush your head, is dreadful because the same word is used for strike in like strike the heel and crush the head. The same verb is used twice. The verb is shuf in Hebrew and literally just means like to hit, like to whack. And so it can have a couple different meanings potentially in context, but in this context, we have no reason to interpret it any other way than strike or hit or attack or assault or something along those lines. So a better translation, what we might call a dynamic translation, is this. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your descendants and hers. They will strike your descendants' heads, and your descendants will strike their heels. Which changes our interpretation a little. Because now we're not dealing with singular people. We're not dealing with Jesus versus Satan. And like I said earlier, I don't think the snake is Satan anyways, or at least it doesn't necessarily have to be. The snake is an image of evil and may or may not be the devil himself. But second of all, we're dealing with striking, with a conflict, with a back and forth. It's not like, hey, you're going to kill him and then he's going to come back from the dead and actually defeat you. Like, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with groups of people that are perpetually in conflict. Now, I lay out all of this evidence, but my biggest one I haven't told you yet, and that is something that, using fancy terms, is called a hermeneutical assumption. A hermeneutical assumption is basically just when you approach scripture, there's like a set of rules you're going to interpret it by. And one of my set of rules that I use, that I was taught by a man that I very much respect, and I think that he's right, is that if the original audience didn't view an Old Testament passage as being about the Messiah, and nothing in the New Testament reinterprets it that way, it's probably not about the Messiah. Issue is, there's no Jewish sources that I've ever come across, or that I've found anyone who has come across, that interpret the Protoevangelium as being about the Messiah. No one took it that way. In addition to that, there's no references to Genesis 3:15 in the New Testament. So if there's no New Testament passages applying it to Jesus, and no Jewish interpreters ever considered it to be about Jesus, it's probably not about Jesus. That is a hermeneutical assumption that I have, but I think it's a valid one. This passage is probably not about Jesus. So if it's not about Jesus, then what is it about? Well, let's talk about that. In my opinion, this passage is about conflict, not a foretelling of the gospel that'll come thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years later. Although it does have a little bit to do with the gospel. We'll get there in a second. I think that this passage is about conflict. It details two different camps. There is the descendants of the snake, and there is the descendants of the woman. And this is somewhat symbolic. Who are the descendants of the snake? If we're dealing with a group of people here, who are justifiably the descendants of the devil or descendants of the ambassador of evil in Genesis 3? Well, those people are those who live a sinful, unrighteous life, right? That's our first camp right over here. We have people who live a sinful, unrighteous life. Over here, we have the descendants of the woman. They are the enemies of the unrighteous. They're the enemies of the sinful. They fight back against people who are sinful. Who are they? They're the righteous. So you have the unrighteous and the righteous. And the idea is they're going to be striking. They're going to be hitting. They're going to be, to use the Hebrew word, shufing at one another. They're going to be attacking one another. And this conflict is going to be unresolved for a very long time. The conflict was totally avoidable. If the man and the woman never sinned, there would be no unrighteous people to have conflict. You'd only have the righteous. There would be no conflict. Life would be wonderful. But the man and the woman sinned, so there's going to be shuf. There's going to be striking. There's going to be conflict between the unrighteous and the righteous, okay? And God needs to resolve that. Now, he doesn't tell the man and the woman that he will resolve it. He doesn't really promise them much of anything. But I believe that God, in his all-knowing power and his authority, he knew that sooner or later he was going to address this. And he begins addressing it with Israel. He addresses it much further when Jesus comes, lives 33-ish years, and then dies on a cross and is resurrected and has this great victory over death and this great victory over the devil. And I believe that he will address it even further and finally when he returns in the second coming, or if you're raised in certain traditions and denominations, you might call it the parousia. So yeah, Genesis 3:15 has a little bit to do with Jesus. It points out an eternal or almost eternal conflict between good and evil, between righteous people and unrighteous people that Jesus will address, that he has already begun to address, and that he will finish, the victory that he will win for the righteous when he returns. But it is not a foretelling of the gospel. It simply shows us that the gospel is deeply, deeply necessary. Now, here's why I think that this matters. In Western Christianity, we have a really bad tendency to read Jesus into every passage. Here's what it means. We'll look at a verse and we'll say, well, how does this verse relate to Jesus? And some passages just don't. They aren't about Jesus. We need to learn to respect the Old Testament for what it is, a group of stories and rules and laws inspired by God and given to God's people that lived in a very different world than we live in today. Now, even though I'm recording this ahead of time and posting it on YouTube later, I can hear the objections coming through my screen. You're saying, Jason, the Old Testament all points to Jesus. And I agree with you, depending on what you mean by all of the Old Testament. If you mean, the Old Testament as a group, as a whole, as a family, as a unit, points to Jesus, well, yeah, I agree with that. The Old Testament prepared Israel and ultimately prepared the world for Jesus to show up. There's dozens, maybe even hundreds of references to Jesus in the Old Testament, some of which were very apparent to the Jews and some which weren't apparent until later. So I agree, the Old Testament prepared the world and prepared Israel for the Messiah, but what I do not agree with is that every individual verse is about Jesus, and that's the issue we're running into here. We're taking a verse that's not about Jesus, and traditionally speaking, we've been forcing Jesus into the verse and then missing its real meaning entirely. When we view the Protoevangelium, we say this is about Jesus, we miss the fact that I think it's really about conflict between the righteous and the unrighteous and the need, or at least it implies the need, for God to step in and fix things. We're missing a really beautiful truth, a beautiful reminder, because we're forcing Jesus into every passage. And for those of you who are looking at me and saying, Jesus is in every passage, Jesus is in every verse, if you can prove to me that Jesus is in the verse where Abraham circumcises himself, I will believe you. But honestly, I don't think Jesus is there, and I think that Abraham was very, very thankful that Jesus wasn't in that particular verse, because that would have gotten really uncomfortable, well, more uncomfortable than it probably already was. Anyways, I guess in summary, here's a lesson for you and me and everybody. I could have sworn to you just, a couple months ago even, that the Protoevangelium, Genesis 3:15, was literally about Jesus, and it was the first pre-telling of the gospel, and that's because that's what I was taught growing up. We need to do our best regardless of what we were taught growing up, regardless of what I'm teaching you. We need to do our best to return to Scripture and to ask, what did the original audience understand this to mean? And what did the author intend for it to mean? And what does God want me to get out of it? Now, if we keep asking those questions over and over, I believe throughout our lives we'll get closer and closer to the truth. Will we ever be 100% right? Probably not. I'm sure there's plenty of things I'm wrong about. I'm sure there's plenty of things you're wrong about too. But if we keep asking those questions and faithfully chasing the answers, I think we'll get closer and closer and closer until Jesus finally returns, or we die, whichever one comes first, and then we'll know for certain, at least. I hope that he'll tell us, because I have a lot of questions for him, things I just don't understand. Now, I would love to go through the rest of the curse on the serpent in Genesis 3. I would love to go through the so-called curses on man and woman, and why I don't like using the word curse there. But we don't really have time because this video is really long as it is. So maybe we'll touch on those next week, or maybe I'll get really ADHD and I'll never talk about them. Who knows? But if you have any questions on them, feel free to ask me, because they've been my hobby horse for the last 2 weeks, and I would really, really love to just nerd rant to someone about it. So feel free to ask me about it if you know me. If not, you can call the church or email us or DM us on Facebook, and I'll be sure to answer. Anyways, in the meantime, hope that I can see you Sunday. Hope that you can share this video and subscribe and like it and all that. That stuff's super helpful to us. And, hopefully I'll see you back here next Wednesday. We're rooting for you. We love you. And we hope to see you in person or online or both in the very, very near future. Bye now.